Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to my Unit 3 presentation. Today we will discuss whether Israel has been able to achieve its strategic objectives in the occupied territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip using force. For a look at whether the Palestinians have achieved their strategic objectives by means of force, please see Melinda Oliver's wonderful presentation on the subject. Okay, here's our agenda. I'll give you a quick introduction. Then we'll start the main presentation by briefly framing our discussion topic today with a few quick thoughts on what we mean when we say assess, what we mean by strategic objectives, and what force looks like within the context of this discussion. We'll also talk briefly about how Israel came to occupy the occupied territories. Then we'll look at Israel's desired end state vis-a-vis the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the strategic objectives to set the conditions for the desired end state. Next, we'll discuss both intifadas, and then we will assess whether Israel's use of force during these two periods moved Israel closer to achieving the strategic objectives of its desired end state. Finally, we'll close with a few final thoughts. Note that I've included the reference of the sources I've drawn information from at the bottom left corner of each slide. Okay, a quick introduction is appropriate for the few of you that I have not shared a module with before. So my name is Stephen Johnson. I'm a U.S. Naval Aviator, and I've been in the service for just under 26 years. My family and I are stationed in the United Kingdom, living just outside of London in a town called Gerrards Cross. I currently work at NATO's Maritime Component Command in Northwood. It's an interesting job, and as you can imagine, very busy these days with everything that's going on in the Black Sea. Okay, so you can see the question we are after in this unit at the very top of the screen. I hope to be able to cover enough information from our readings to be able to assess whether Israel has been able to achieve its strategic objectives by using force. Again, I'm only going to cover the Israeli side of the problem. Melinda, and perhaps some of our other presenters, will cover the Palestinian perspective. So to begin the conversation, let's pick apart our question and see what we're after. What do we mean when we say assess? Well, we're going to want to be able to make an informed judgment about the strengths or weaknesses of each side of the argument and decide whether the objectives were achieved or not. So the bottom line is, by the end of the presentation, we want to be able to give a definitive yes, the Israelis succeeded in achieving their strategic objectives, or no, they failed. Next, what do we mean when we say strategic objectives? Well, this is a useful question to ask yourself and for us to look at, especially if you aren't enrolled in the Strategic Dimensions of Contemporary War module. If you are, you may recall that Karl von Clausewitz tells us that strategy is the link between military means and a desired political end state. It can be thought of as the process that translates armed force into a political effect. In other words, strategy translates political goals into objectives that are achievable by military force. Or, in a more linear order, political goals inform the strategy, which consists of your strategic objectives that are achievable by a specific national instrument of power. This, of course, segues into what do we mean by force? Well, if you look at the means by which any state can influence the actions of another, you'll see a state has 7 of what we call national instruments of power. They are diplomatic, information, military, economic, financial, intelligence, and law enforcement. So, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to concentrate on the military instrument of power, although no doubt that both sides of the conflict have used all forms of power to try to influence the behavior of the other. Finally, if you'll recall from our previous unit, the June 1967 Six-Day War was a conflict where Israel was invaded by a coalition of Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian forces. After 6 days of tough fighting, Israel had nearly tripled in size, occupying the territories of the Golan Heights, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Sinai, and the Gaza Strip. In order to limit what has the potential to be a very large and unwieldy topic, we're going to concentrate on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, which were all three areas where both the First and the Second Intifada took place. So if I happen to say occupied territories, please understand that I'm only talking about those three areas and nothing else. So why do I mention that? Well, currently Israel occupies only the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Israel gave the Sinai back to Egypt in 1982 after the signing of the 1979 Egypt-Israeli Peace Treaty. Additionally, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip in August of 2005. Israel's desired end state, in the context of the occupied territories, is a sustainable peace settlement between the Palestinians and a strong and secure Israel. So with that in mind, in the years following the Six-Day War and prior to the Oslo peace process, Israel's strategic objectives centered around three arguments. First, but perhaps least important, is a portion of Israeli society wanted to keep the occupied territories for religious purposes. However, this was a minority position, except in the case of East Jerusalem. Secondly, holding on to the occupied territories created strategic depth for the Israelis in the event of an attack by one of its Arab neighbors. This is where the main strategic threat to Israel resided. Within this context, holding on to the West Bank was critical, as it would be key terrain in any invasion by Iraq, Jordan, or Syria. Holding this terrain also provided a buffer against Palestinian infiltrators coming across the border. Finally, trading these territories for peace also became a real possibility, and this was the basis of the 1993 Oslo Accords. Israel could turn territory over to the Palestinians as a gesture of good faith in negotiations. This strategic concept worked very well from 1967 until the end of the 1980s, and reasonably well for another 10 years until the end of the 1990s. However, Israel's experience during the failed 1993 to 2000 Oslo peace process and the subsequent Al-Aqsa Intifada changed this. Regardless of whether or not the failure of the peace process was due to Israeli or Palestinian actions, Israeli leaders believed that they had made big concessions in what they offered, and they were taking a huge political and security gamble, only to have their offers rejected. What followed was a 4.5-year conflict, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. The Israelis concluded that achieving peace would be a lot harder and take a lot longer than they had anticipated, and Israel's security environment began to look very different. From these experiences came a new synthesis of left and right thinking. The left believed Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories and dismantle many of the settlements and accept a free Palestinian state in exchange for peace. This merged well with the political right, who believed that there would be no viable partner to negotiate with anytime soon. The common goal of Israel's new strategic agenda would be to 1. Ensure Israel's security by strengthening its defense against terrorism. 2. Reject wishful thinking in that the Palestinian Authority would ever fully cooperate to eliminate terrorism from Israel and the occupied territories. And 3. Consolidate control over small portions of the West Bank that Israel intended to claim as part of a diplomatic settlement. The Israelis recognized holding on to the occupied territories indefinitely was not in their best interests, even though Hamas and Fatah seemed uninterested or incapable of negotiating a lasting peace, and that if returned to the Palestinians, the territories would serve as a place for the Palestinians to launch rockets and mortars into Israel. Furthermore, the territories did not provide Israel the strategic depth that it once needed, as the threat of conventional attack by neighboring Arab armies was increasingly unlikely. Additionally, Israel would be better off putting valuable military resources to good use by creating a strong defensive line as opposed to having them scattered to patrol the occupied territories. Finally, as a comprehensive peace deal seemed elusive over the long term, they had little value as bargaining chips. So now that we know Israel's strategic thinking within the context of the occupied territories, let us look at the first and the second intifadas to understand how Israelis used force to maintain control within the occupied territories. The first intifada lasted from 1987 to 1993. While it saw a lower level of violence compared to the second intifada, which we'll cover in a moment, it was still a watershed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Both intifadas were significantly different from the other major wars Israel had fought. They were far more unconventional than what the Israelis were used to. The first intifada may have been intended to be a non-violent means of demonstrating against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but this isn't how it turned out. As background, in the years leading up to the first intifada, as the PLO conducted major cross-border terror operations into Israel, the Palestinians lived under Israeli rule in the occupied territories were becoming restless and more militant. Now, several factors played into this. Among them are the development of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the high levels of unemployment for Palestinians, and their general treatment by the Israelis. Of note, a few Palestinians also saw the emergence of Israeli left-wing political parties as a chance to influence Israel's policy in the occupied territories. Finally, the merging of religion with Arab nationalism by groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood also provided inspiration and an ideology to inspire the masses. It also led to the rise of Hamas in the early months of the First Intifada. Hamas is particularly violently anti-Jewish, calling for the destruction of Israel as a state. Now, the spark which ignited the Intifada was a traffic accident that took place on December the 8th, 1987. 4 Palestinian workers were killed when an Israeli truck driver crashed into a row of cars at an Israeli checkpoint. The following day, thousands of mourners attended the funeral, where rumors spread which alleged the crash was intentional. That day, demonstrations quickly turned violent in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, and massive protests quickly spread into East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This was a whole new level of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Intifada took on a life of its own. Civil disobedience and mass demonstration was the main strategy of the movement, backed by such acts as businessmen refusing to pay taxes and consumers boycotting Israeli goods. Now, in theory, the movement leadership had agreed to refrain from using weapons in the demonstrations. However, this did not prevent the Palestinian demonstrators from engaging Israeli troops with non-lethal weapons such as rocks, bricks, glass bottles, while also blocking roads with such things as logs, fires, burning tires, and other methods. This didn't last, though, as the PLO co-opted the demonstration, and the Intifada could no longer be called nonviolent. After the Israelis shook off their initial shock, they responded with decisiveness. But this was a situation the IDF was ill-trained and ill-prepared for. The Israeli government used various methods to put down the violence, including curfews and the cutting of phone and electric lines. They even went so far as to uproot trees to deny the Palestinian protesters and population places to hide. Furthermore, they tore down houses of those they suspected of committing serious crimes. And whereas this decision had required special approval of the defense minister at the start of the Intifada, this decision was delegated to local commanders, therefore making the destruction of Palestinian homes a common occurrence. Deportations were also used to quell the disturbances, as was the closure of schools and universities. Now, for the soldiers themselves, the Defense Minister Rabin, put them in a particularly difficult situation and ordered the IDF to act forcefully in putting down the riots. Israeli forces initially used live ammunition, but this was a complete disaster from a public relations standpoint, and at which point they switched to rubber bullets with steel centers. The Israelis would also amend legal procedures to enable mass arrests. However, these mass incarcerations turned into mass political education, as jails function as political schools for the detainees. Many of the early detainees, in fact, turned into movement leaders in the subsequent years. Overall, these methods did not have the intended effect the Israeli government had hoped for. They only served to inspire young Palestinians to further their demonstrations. At the end of the day, Israel had no good answer for the Palestinian uprising, and what response they did put forth only served to allow the PLO to present itself in a more moderate light as a victim of Israeli persecution. On the international stage, Israel had become the Goliath, and the Palestinians had become David. The signing of the 1993 Oslo Agreement ended the Intifada and enabled a return to some sort of normality in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and the Jewish-Arab relationship within Israel proper. But as we shall see, this didn't last for long. The Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, was a tragedy in human terms. The conflict began in September of 2000 and claimed more than 1,000 Israeli and 3,200 Palestinian lives, many of them civilian. While most people think that the Al-Aqsa Intifada is merely an extension of the First Intifada, there were significant differences between the two. For instance, during the First Intifada, many of the demonstrators fought with nothing more than rocks and glass bottles. However, during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, these were supplanted by small arms, grenades, mortars, and significantly, by suicide bombers. Additionally, Palestinians targeted Israeli military and civilians alike, and the level of brutality exceeded what had been seen previously. Similarly to the First Intifada, there was a single event that we can point to as the spark that ignited the powder keg. On September 28th of 2000, then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, one of the holiest sites in Jerusalem. Importantly, this site also contains the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a Muslim holy site. Now, because of the sensitive nature of the site, this was seen as a particularly provocative move in the eyes of the Palestinians. Although the visit itself was relatively calm, demonstrators broke out in violence in the Old City of Jerusalem the next day. The Israeli police responded in force, and by the end of it, 5 Palestinian demonstrators lay dead with more than 200 civilians injured. Other demonstrations followed throughout the occupied territories in the days that followed. Of course, the roots of the Al-Aqsa Intifada went much deeper than this. For the Palestinians, the causes lay in the failure of the Israelis to live up to the Oslo Accords, as well as their continued presence in the occupied territories. The Palestinians had expected a real improvement in their daily lives, and this just did not happen. When the Palestinians believed that diplomacy had failed, they turned once again to confrontation. On September 30th, a gunfight between the IDF and Palestinians broke out in the Gaza Strip, where a 12-year-old boy and his father were caught in the middle of a crossfire and killed. This was caught on camera, and soon, the images replayed on TV fueled the fire that was the rapidly escalating war. Another set of tragic events occurred 2 days later, when 2 Israeli soldiers mistakenly entered the city of Ramallah. Palestinian police stopped them and took them to the police station in an effort to protect them. But the 2 soldiers were soon discovered by Palestinian demonstrators and murdered, with one of their bodies being mutilated and dragged through the street. The violence continued to intensify after the Ramallah lynching, and the Israeli government initiated a massive retaliation. The gloves came off. The Israeli Prime Minister had the IDF draw up lists of targets, and the use of helicopter gunships was authorized. Importantly, to keep things from spiraling out of control with the loss of innocent lives, the Israelis warned the Palestinians of the impending strikes and kept Egyptian President Mubarak advised. In the following weeks and months, as the Israelis became more and more desperate to end the violence, Prime Minister Barak turned to the use of targeted killings to crack down on the violence, a policy which had worked well in the past. However, this too failed to stop the Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians. As the Palestinian attacks continued in the absence of a political solution, the Israeli public moved to the right on the political spectrum, and in February of 2001, elected former Defense Minister Ariel Sharon to the position of Prime Minister. The violence reached epic proportions between June 2001 and the spring of 2002, with March being a particularly bloody month with the deaths of 239 Palestinians, 133 Israelis, in 17 separate suicide attacks. In response, Israel undertook a massive military retaliation known as Operation Defensive Shield. This plan involved taking over cities Israel had ceded to Palestinians as part of the Oslo Accord. Some of these cities had become terror bases from which terror attacks were launched into Israel. The campaign also called for the Israeli military to isolate Arafat inside his headquarters compound. The effect was a significant drop in the number of suicide bombings coming from the West Bank. The threat to civilians was not eliminated, but it was greatly diminished. Notwithstanding these successes, the sieges used by the Israeli armed forces at places like Ramallah and Bethlehem, and the fallout of the Battle of Jenin were another PR disaster for Israel. Furthermore, the tit-for-tat violence that followed failed to put an end to Palestinian insurgency, and the cycle continued unabated. By the end of 2003, ideas for a unilateral withdrawal on the part of the Israelis began to take root. This plan consisted of 4 key elements. First, politically isolate Arafat and the Palestinian Authority in order to force the former to resign and the latter to reform. Second, target the Palestinian Authority military structure to weaken Arafat's support base. Third, decapitate Hamas and the Islamic Jihad to reduce their military capacity. And finally, Sharon wanted to physically separate Israel and the occupied territories. He planned to do this with a security fence along the West Bank. This final part caused a significant decrease in the number of suicide bombings in Israel. This was followed up with Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip and the northern part of the West Bank in August of 2005. Furthermore, the death of Yasser Arafat in October of 2005 helped remove some of the motivation from within the Palestinian camp. The new Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, Mahmoud Abbas, agreed to a summit meeting with Sharon, and the two men agreed to a ceasefire. After this, the Al-Aqsa Intifada seemed to just fade away, although the hardcore fundamentalists refused to be constrained by the ceasefire. Now that we understand the impact of Israel's use of force during the First and Second Intifadas, let's assess whether Israel achieved the desired strategic objectives which underpin its endstate. So, our original question remains to be answered. Did Israel achieve its strategic objectives in the occupied territories through the use of force? Well, we know that Israel's desired political endstate was a sustainable peace settlement between the Palestinians and a strong, secure Israel. After the Six-Day War, Israel achieved the strategic depth it needed by maintaining an occupation force within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. However, Palestinian desires for an independent state, as well as their living conditions under Israeli occupation, brought about an insurgency movement in the form of the First Intifada. And while the Palestinians eventually came to the negotiating table in 1993, world events and the military cost of the occupation had more to do with the signing of the Oslo Accords than Israel's iron fist policy. As the Oslo peace process continued, Israel was happy to use the occupied territories as bargaining chips in negotiations. But this was not enough for the Palestinians, as they could not come to an agreement on the issues such as the status of the Palestinian refugees. When the peace process failed, and another intifada was touched off at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 2000, the political realities on the ground and the ugly characteristics of the Palestinians' terror-based warfare caused a paradigm shift for the Israelis. Seeing the need for a new agenda, Israel's leaders attempted to achieve the desired sustainable peace through new strategic objectives in the form of a unilateral withdrawal to strengthen Israel's defenses and consolidation of control over a smaller portion of the territories which Israel intended to lay claim to. The bottom line is that while Israel did achieve its strategic objectives using force, it was not able to end the Al-Aqsa Intifada or even approach the desired end state of a lasting peace until it made a unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and initiated a slow withdrawal from the West Bank, where it currently controls about 61% of the land. So my assessment is Israel achieved its strategic objectives after the Six-Day War, but it has failed to achieve a permanent peace settlement with the Palestinians. You can probably tell that this is a more nuanced answer than just a simple yes or no to the question, has Israel been able to achieve its strategic objectives by force? Referring back to Clausewitz, it's important to remember that political end states are underpinned by strategic objectives, and success in one does not mean success in the other. Well, this begs the question, why? Was it a mismatch between Israel's strategic objectives and the desired end state? Was it a failure of execution? Should they have taken a less kinetic approach? Or are the Palestinians never going to accept an Israeli state in the land they call Palestine? I look forward to seeing your thoughts on this week's discussion forum. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something. I appreciate your time and patience. And of course, in the words of the great American pop culture icon, Porky Pig, that's all, folks.